I'll start us off with this. This is not a love story. It's a case study on how an affair was able to function inside the most closely watched court in England until all parties involved found themselves on the wrong end of an axe. Catherine Howard became queen at an age when most people are still being reminded not to text their ex. Instead, she married Henry VIII. He was old, nearly 30 years older than her actually, increasingly ill, and already had an unfortunate habit of disposing of wives once they ceased to be useful. This was meant to look like renewal, youth beside experience, beauty beside authority. A king proving once again that time had not won. Time, naturally, disagreed. Catherine arrived at court young, unseasoned, and immediately placed under observation. Constant observation, the sort that smiled politely while it watched. She was attended at all hours, followed discreetly, interrupted efficiently. Doors opened when they were meant to and closed only when allowed. Privacy was not a feature of queenship, it was a controlled substance. But, Henry, he adored her, publicly, loudly. He showered Catherine with jewels, compliments and enthusiasm. She was living evidence that he was still desirable, still virile, still in command of his kingdom and his body. Privately, Henry was busy, with pain from his grossly oozing leg ulcer, with politics, what with being king and all, and with the tedious realisation that absolute power does not prevent ageing, it simply gives you better mirrors. So Catherine was left to fill her time inside a court that excelled at spectacle, but showed very little interest in companionship. This is worth noting, because affairs at the Tudor court did not begin with passion. They began with opportunity. And the opportunity was exceptional. Henry Tudor's court ran on routine, predictable movements, predictable schedules, predictable people. Everyone knew where they were meant to be and when they were meant to be there. Deviations were noticed, absences were remembered. It was not chaos, it was a machine, a very concise one. Catherine learned this quickly. She learned when Henry slept deeply. She learned how long it took servants to make their rounds. She learned which ladies retired early and which lingered for reasons they never bothered to explain. She learned which corridors emptied after dusk and which retained memory. This was not scheming, this was orientation. Being queen did not grant Catherine autonomy, it granted her visibility. Her body, her reputation, even her stillness belonged to the crown. Henry VIII did not share what he believed he owned, and queens, historically speaking, fell squarely into that category. This court had been shaped by paranoia, not without cause. One queen quietly discarded, another very publicly erased. Trust had not survived these experiments. Surveillance had. And yet, ironically, the more closely Catherine was watched, the more sophisticated her manoeuvring needed to become. Secrecy at court was never accidental. It was planned, timed, managed. And no, Catherine was not reckless. That interpretation would be assembled later, very neatly, by men trying to explain why they were still alive and she was not. What she actually was, quite clearly, was young, isolated, and married to a man who provided ceremony instead of intimacy. Loneliness at court was subtle. It didn't cry, it waited. It arrived during long evenings, enforced stillness, moments when nothing was required of you except patience. And the court, ever obliging, supplied proximity. Familiar faces appeared with comforting regularity. Conversations lasted slightly longer than necessary. Glances lingered. Attention felt warm, personal, human, not treasonous. Not yet. What Catherine didn't understand was how narrow the margin for error truly was. For a queen, desire was not personal, it was political. Her body symbolized legitimacy, succession, stability. Even the suggestion of impropriety could be reshaped into accusation. Even restraint could be reinterpreted after the fact. At Henry's court, it wasn't what you did that mattered most. It was what could be reconstructed later by men with ink, time, and motive. And still, affairs did happen. Not because people were foolish, but because systems built on control tend to underestimate boredom. And boredom, unlike treason, requires no witnesses. Catherine lived inside a court convinced it could see everything. And it was true, someone was always watching. Now, the way that story would be retold, well, that's the real question. This is the world in which Catherine Howard lived, not a reckless girl chasing scandal, but a young queen learning, quietly, how power actually worked. Through routine, through access, through proximity. Which brings us, inevitably, to Thomas Culpeper. Because this story does not begin with love, it begins with convenience. And convenience at the Tudor court had a remarkable tendency to end in blood. Thomas Culpeper didn't arrive at Catherine Howard's chambers by accident. Men like Culpeper rarely did anything by accident. They benefited too much from being exactly where they were supposed to be. He was handsome, swoon-worthy. This is mentioned often and not without reason. But beauty alone was not his most dangerous quality. Plenty of attractive men passed through the Tudor court and survived it. What set Culpeper apart was access. He belonged. Culpeper served in the king's household. He moved through court not as a curiosity, but as a fixture. He was familiar, trusted, recognised. The kind of man servants stepped aside for without being told to. This mattered more than charm ever could. Henry VIII liked Culpeper, which, historically speaking, was a far more perilous position than disfavour. Royal favour created confidence. Confidence created carelessness. And carelessness at court had a long paper trail. Culpeper was close enough to power to feel untouchable. Not immune exactly, but buffered. He existed inside the machinery rather than beneath it. He knew the rhythms, the expectations, the blind spots, wink wink. And Catherine noticed him, because everyone noticed him. He wasn't some mysterious court figure. He didn't need to be. He was present, reliably present, which, in a court that ran on repetition, meant he was actually easy to overlook. This is where proximity becomes dangerous. Catherine was queen. Culpeper was a courtier. Their paths crossed naturally, casually, in ways that didn't raise eyebrows because they weren't meant to. Shared spaces, shared duties, shared moments of polite attention that carried no official significance. Nothing improper, nothing provable, yet. See, Culpeper understood something Catherine was still learning. That intimacy at court did not require isolation. It required familiarity. Being seen often enough that seeing you together meant nothing at all. This is how access works. It hides inside routine. And Culpeper had access in abundance. He could move through corridors at night without question. He could appear in doorways without explanation. He could speak to Catherine under the comforting assumption that everything was, of course, entirely proper. After all, Henry trusted him, which meant others did too. That trust would become very important later, particularly when it vanished. There is no clear moment where historians can point and say, this is when it became an affair. Records prefer vagueness and shadowy references. Depositions hedge. Language grows careful when survival depends on interpretation. But what we can say, with confidence, is that Culpeper was not naive. He understood the stakes. A queen's body was not merely personal. It was symbolic, political, dangerous. Any intimacy carried consequences well beyond emotion. And yet, he stayed close. Culpeper was not reckless in the way youth often is. He was reckless in the way men close to power tend to be. He assumed the system that protected him would continue to do so. He assumed his position insulated him from scrutiny. Not so different from men today, is it? History suggests this was optimistic. Catherine, for her part, did not experience Culpeper as a threat to her standing, and definitely not to her life. He was not an intruder. He was not disruptive. He fit neatly into the world she already inhabited. He did not demand secrecy at first. He did not force intimacy. He occupied space comfortably, attentively. He listened. And listening, at court, could feel intimate enough. This is how danger presents itself when it intends to linger. Culpeper didn't arrive like temptation. He arrived like inevitability, like someone who had always been there and always would be. And because he belonged, no one thought to question his presence. Not yet, at least. While the Tudor court was very good at watching strangers, it was much less skilled at watching its own, which made Culpeper, quietly, extraordinarily dangerous. Because when an affair finally requires coordination, timing, and discretion, the most valuable thing is not passion, oh no, it's permission. And Thomas Culpeper had already been granted it, in abundance. What Catherine didn't yet understand, though, was that access cuts both ways. The same familiarity that allowed Culpeper to approach her would later allow the court to reconstruct every step he took. But for now, he remained what the court believed him to be: trusted, present, unremarkable. The most lethal combination of all. And this is where the story shifts, because access alone does not create secrecy. For that, Catherine and Culpeper would need something else entirely. Someone who understood the system even better than they did. Because being able to enter a room is one thing. Staying unseen once you're inside requires professional help. After all, affairs at the Tudor court didn't run on passion. They ran on your staffing. And this affair in particular would require a woman who understood the system well enough to bend it without snapping it. Enter Lady Rochford. She had survived court long enough to know exactly how it worked, and was one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, which meant she saw everything. The routines, the pauses, the moments when nothing happened, and the moments when something very carefully did. She knew when Catherine's chambers were the busiest and when they emptied. She knew which servants moved quickly and which ones lingered, who noticed patterns and who noticed nothing at all. But all this was not the villainy it would later be painted as. This was competence, which pulling off an affair of this magnitude would absolutely require. because privacy at court was never about hiding completely. That would have been virtually impossible, especially for a queen. It was about those stolen moments, ever so small, happening right under everyone's noses. In intervals, of course, slivers of time no one bothered to audit. Lady Rochford understood that you don't fight routine, you use it. So no, Catherine never slipped away dramatically. She followed her usual rhythms, just adjusted. A door closed slightly longer than usual. A servant dismissed a little earlier than expected. A pause inserted where no one thought to question it. Lady Rochford provided those pauses. Small beats of time carved out to perfection. She dusted the court floors with little white lies thrown out like rice at a wedding. Small ones, boring ones, the kind no one remembers because they sound exactly like the truth. And in a court obsessed with scandal, boredom was camouflage. This was not secrecy fueled by passion, it was secrecy fueled by scheduling. She sounds pretty type A, if you ask me. She knew how long a door could remain shut before it became interesting, and when footsteps in a corridor would blend into background noise. But most importantly, she knew when Catherine could plausibly be alone without anyone becoming curious. The meetings were brief, always brief. Not because restraint was virtuous, but because duration was literally dangerous. Doors were locked from the inside, signals were given. Culpeper arrived when he was supposed to be elsewhere and left before anyone had time to remember seeing him. No witnesses inside the room, ever. And only risk lay outside it. This is the point where people like to imagine romance, whispered words and soft touches, candlelight, the thrill of transgression. The reality was much less indulgent. Every meeting required coordination, and every meeting increased the odds of miscalculation, potentially adding another mark to a ledger the court would eventually review with great interest. But Lady Rochford understood this. She dealt in logistics, not fantasy. And logistics have no patience for sentiment. She knew something Catherine and Culpeper were still learning. That secrecy is not the absence of attention. It is the careful redirection of it. You don't remove eyes, you distract them. And for a while, it worked. She pulled it off. Catherine remained visible, proper, doing exactly what a young queen was expected to do. Culpeper remained familiar, trusted, forgettable in the way only well-placed men can be. And Lady Rochford remained where she had always been, watching, adjusting, fixing small problems before they became larger ones. This is how the affair functioned, not recklessly, not impulsively, but efficiently. Which was ultimately the problem, because efficiency creates patterns. And at court, patterns are eventually noticed. Someone always remembers when doors close too often, and someone always starts paying attention just a moment too soon. Lady Rochford knew this. She had lived long enough to know how quickly assistance could be reframed as guilt, how easily proximity could become evidence. But by the time the patterns began to settle, the machinery was already running. Culpeper would arrive to Catherine's chambers when his presence would register as background noise, and left before anyone had time to form an opinion. It worked because it felt reasonable, safe. Inside the room, it was easy to believe this was under control. There were no witnesses, no interruptions, and no immediate consequences. Which, naturally, is how people convince themselves they are clever. We've outsmarted them all. But outside those chamber doors, the court was doing what it always did: watching. Not actively, not dramatically, but in that casual, silent way, people notice patterns without even realising they've started keeping track. In that, that's interesting kind of way. But no one ever burst in on them or knocked the door down. No one accused. No one needed to. Because repetition does the work eventually, quietly. Doors closed at similar hours. Culpeper passed through familiar corridors too often. Absences aligned just enough to feel intentional. Nothing quite scandalous, just noticeably consistent. And consistency in a place like Henry VIII's court was never neutral. This is the part people like to imagine as thrilling, the risk, the danger, the near misses. Catherine believed the danger was being caught in the act, but that's rarely the case. The odds of them being walked in on, a tangled web of mouths and legs, was extremely low. Though what a scandal that would have been. But no, the real danger lies in being noticed just often enough that someone starts wondering, why? By the time the meetings felt routine, the court had already begun assembling a version of events, not complete, not proven, but tidy, logical explanations drawn from a rapidly growing list of moments that were almost too well timed. And explanations, once echoed enough, have a habit of looking like truth. And the truth was, Catherine and Culpeper weren't outrunning surveillance. They were normalising themselves within it, which may have been one of their biggest missteps. Because courts don't need certainty to act. They don't need facts, they need plausibility. And plausibility thrives on repetition. So no, the affair hadn't technically been discovered, but it had managed to be mapped. And that is the moment the story changes. Because once an affair becomes predictable, it stops belonging to the people having it. It belongs to everyone else. And by the time Catherine Howard realised something was wrong, the matter had already been settled. She, Culpeper, and Lady Rochford had dug a hole far too great for any of them to climb out of. See, this is the mistake people make when they imagine royal justice. They picture discovery. We've uncovered actual evidence of a crime, followed by deliberation. Now, let's all come to a conclusion based on our concrete evidence. Innocent until proven guilty, right? Unfortunately for all parties involved, Henry VIII's court preferred the opposite. First, the conclusion of guilt, then due process, if you can even call it that. When they came for him, Culpeper wasn't surprised. He didn't yell or fight or declare his innocence. He was removed, quietly, efficiently, as one removes a chess piece from a board once its role is finished. Unlike Catherine, Culpeper knew how these things ended. He had seen men questioned before. He had seen how stories were shaped, trimmed, simplified until they became useful. So when he was asked to speak, he did. His confession didn't gush, some sorrowful plea of denial or forgiveness. It acknowledged enough to be credible and not enough to be generous. Whether the affair had been fully consummated remains debated. Henry VIII, by this point, was no longer interested in nuance. Intention and possibility was sufficient enough. Catherine, meanwhile, was still operating under a different set of assumptions. She believed denial mattered. that silence mattered, that what couldn't be proven couldn't destroy her. This tidbit is commonly aligned with the foolish girl persona Catherine's been branded with by many historical accounts. But was it foolish? Or was it simply youth? A young girl, only about 17 years old. If anything, her crime was naivety and a fundamental misunderstanding of how power behaved when threatened. Now, as for Henry, he didn't actually want to believe the accusations at first. This detail is often skipped, but it matters. When the first reports reached him, he didn't explode. He didn't demand heads. He withdrew. He asked for distance, for written accounts, for something solid enough to actually condemn his young queen. Perhaps having jumped the gun with Anne Boleyn made him a little more mindful? No, but Catherine was young. She was compliant. She reflected well on him. Believing she had betrayed him required Henry to accept something far more uncomfortable than just anger. He'd have to admit that he'd misjudged her. And Henry VIII did not enjoy being wrong. So he delayed, briefly, and then instructed Thomas Cranmer, his chief religious advisor, to interrogate her. Catherine was questioned, carefully, repeatedly, with a politeness that should have been alarming. She wasn't asked to defend herself. She was asked to remember, essentially to confirm her guilt versus her innocence. The judgment had been made. Her words were recorded, reordered, reinterpreted. The story no longer belonged to her, it belonged to the men writing it down. By the end of her interrogation, Catherine was no longer just a young, naive queen who had made a series of unwise but forgivable decisions. And now there was another problem Henry VIII hadn't fully reckoned with yet. Catherine Howard didn't enter this marriage alone. She brought a past with her, a past that quickly unfolded under the pressure of the accusations built against her. Because if we know nothing else about an investigation in the Tudor court, we know that no stone is left unturned. Enter Francis Derham. Now, Derham had known Catherine before she was queen, known her well enough to believe that mattered. He had been part of her earlier life, back when promises were informal and consequences theoretical. And where Culpeper left everything to the imagination, Derham left very little. He spoke freely, too freely. He explained himself. He contextualized. He'd admitted, willingly, that he and Catherine had been intimate, that he called her wife and she'd called him husband, that it wasn't a secret and that they'd promised themselves to each other long before she'd ever stepped foot at court. Catherine corroborated this fact as well. Oh, but surely since this all happened before her marriage to Henry VIII, he should be in the clear, right? Wrong. Derham had sealed his own fate. Having carnal knowledge of a queen thought to have been a virgin at the time of her marriage to Henry VIII, and thinking you'd be free to go, yeah, think again. He'd be condemned, sentenced to death, right alongside Culpeper. At any rate, it's said that Derham had allegedly weaseled his way into his position as the Queen's private secretary by way of blackmail, using Catherine's fear of their past being uncovered as leverage. This is the reason he was so easily accessible for interrogation in the first place. Ironically, had he not threatened his way into her household at court, he very possibly could have remained far removed from Catherine's ultimate undoing and might have kept his head. Oh, and Lady Rochford. Don't think they forgot about her, because they definitely did not. She was key to the entire operation, and her role couldn't possibly be ignored. And even if they couldn't prove her involvement exactly, they knew she knew. When questioned, Lady Rochford did what many intelligent people do when trapped inside a system they once mastered. She tried to explain. She contextualized. She clarified. She believed her competence might distinguish her from guilt, that her understanding of court mechanics might read as professionalism rather than participation. It didn't. Knowledge alone at this stage was irrevocably incriminating. She was entirely too close to the fire for her not to get burned. Now, in popular culture, Lady Rochford is often portrayed as some kind of architect, a schemer, the woman pulling strings behind the curtain. But the records actually suggest something far less theatrical. She wasn't a mastermind. She didn't design the affair, but she did manage it. And in Henry VIII's court, that was no different than intent. Her fate was sealed, not because she loved Catherine, but because she had helped her. And help, once reframed, is indistinguishable from conspiracy. For this, she would lose her head. And so it went like this. Derham paid for Catherine's past, Culpeper paid for her present, and Lady Rochford paid for making it all possible. Catherine followed last. The final damning straw that broke the camel's back? She left receipts. Not metaphorical ones, actual ones. Catherine had done something remarkably human and catastrophically unwise. She had written things down. Before Culpeper ever confessed, before Henry fully decided what he believed, Catherine Howard put her feelings into words and trusted them to ink. Letters, plural, signed and sealed with love. Yours as long as life endureth. Henry could dismiss a rumour, but documented humiliation, different story. By the time she was led to the scaffold, there was nothing left to argue. The affair had been reduced to words on a page, feelings stripped away, intent preserved neatly on parchment. This is how Catherine Howard's story ended, the way many Tudor stories end, if you think about it. Because in Henry VIII's court, secrets were never really secret. We'll see you soon for our next walk through the corridors of Hampton Court. Until next time.